Shelley Fraser Mickle here with us today. She's the author of Borrowing Life, one of our spring 20 books that we're very proud of, and I'm delighted that Shelley, that you've joined us here today. Shelley's an award-winning novelist whose first novel, The Queen of October, was a New York Times notable book. And it was actually selected. I mean, this is a Library Journal event, and The Queen of October was selected by Library Journal as one of the 10 best adult books suitable for young adults. She also wrote Replacing Dad, which won an American Writers Award in Chicago and was adapted into a film starring Mary McDonnell and featured on the Hallmark Channel. She's a long-standing author of wonderful books for young people. Her nonfiction book for middle grade teachers, Barbaro, America's Horse, won a Bank Street Award. And another middle grade book called American Pharaoh Triple Crown Champion, which was chosen by the New York Public Library as one of the best nonfiction books of 2017. Shelley, I know you've been a contributor to NPR's Morning Edition, and most recently, the author of Borrowing Life, which is an Imagine book about the first organ transplant, kidney transplant, which happened here in Boston, I'm proud to say. And Shelley, this was a joy for me to work on with you, joy to be able to work with such an accomplished author on such a really remarkable story of on so many levels. And I wonder maybe if we could begin today by you describing a little bit about the genesis of the book, and what was it about this story that made you believe that it would be great narrative nonfiction?
Sure. Thank you for that introduction, Kevin. It's great to meet you, even in this little square. Yeah. I have a cat that's walked in, wants to get on. So anyway, it takes many people to make a book, and I'm very appreciative of Charles Bridge and Kevin and everyone that worked on this book. And I think we knew early on that we had in our hands very valuable book that could change readers' lives. So I think we were all bonded in knowing how valuable this book was to bring to the readers. It's a long history, actually, of how I came upon this idea. As you introduced all the things I've written or done over the years, you get the idea that I've been in this business a long time. So in 1969, about 50 years ago, my husband trained in surgery at the Peterbilt Brigham Hospital under Dr. Joe Murray and Dr. Francis Moore. And I didn't exactly know who they were. We were in our 20s. And then in 1990, Joe Murray was awarded the Nobel Prize for the first successful kidney transplant. Transplantation then was being recognized as one of the most valuable contributions to humankind in the 20th century. And at that time, about 1990, I met Dr. Murray, and it was a wonderful experience, of course. But recently, in the last 4 years, I began to wonder if it had been written, the story for the lay public, this amazing medical history that affects so many people every year, every day. Like there are 50,000 people waiting for a transplant at any given time around the world. So I started doing a little research about that. And of course, my husband mentioned when I wanted to do narrative nonfiction, he said, you know, Joe's story would probably make a good book. So I started researching it, and I thought right off, well, surely this has been done by Walter Isaacson or David McCullough, someone of that ilk, because the subject is so important. And I discovered it had not been done. And Dr. Murray wrote his own book, but it's like going to grand rounds. He wrote it for other medical professionals. It's very difficult for us lay people to really understand or appreciate what was happening in all of that 10 years of research, 18 years to get immunosuppressant drugs. So anyway, I started researching it, and then I called Boston University because I knew that Rick Murray's was Joe's son, who was a professor there, and talked to him and asked him, has anyone written this story yet? Would you let me have a try? So he was very encouraging, and that's how I got started. And Dr. Murray's children, he had 6 children, and they were actually very supportive of my doing this, even though they didn't quite know my quality of work. It was a act of faith on their part.
Mhm.
But I started doing the research and realized that the 3 men that were really involved in this, Peter Menawar, who's British, not many people in America know about him for that reason, and Dr. Moore, who is instrumental in protecting every patient that walks through any hospital door. He's one of the most famous surgeons in American medical history. And he guided Joe in Brigham to make this possible. And then, of course, the twins that were the first transplant. And I just started calling around the country trying to locate people that were involved in this story. And one day, Cynthia Herrick in Maine answered the telephone, and she was the donor's widow, and she helped me a lot. So anyway, we knew, Kevin and I knew, and all at Charles Bridge, that if I could pull this off, we would have the kind of story that would really change readers' lives, to know this inspiring story.
And you did pull it off, Shelley, no question about it. It's a very compelling narrative. One of the things that I loved about it from the beginning, even just seeing, your sample originally, was that it had the intensity and personal quality of a novel, even though it was tackling, quite scientific, quite medical subject matter. And, it did that, I think, by focusing very much on the people and the human stories that made up this, magnificent collection of events that led to something so groundbreaking. I think we all take for granted now the fact that organ transplants are routine and that they happen so often, and we don't really appreciate. You've really taught people in this book, you teach people what amazing science went into allowing that to happen. But I'm interested, Shelley, in also wondering who you targeted as your readers and where you thought the book would land. And also in that context, how you think this pandemic has impacted it.
Right. Well, I'm worried about this pandemic because I want people to read. If you're sitting home, I want people to read books. And when I was researching this and writing and learning how to write it, I was just so excited about everything I learned. I wanted to stand on the street corner and just yell it to everybody driving by. I got so excited about these lives in the greatest generation. The book starts with a pilot who is taking 28,000 gallons of aviation fuel over the Himalayan mountains to the Chinese to defend against Japan at the beginning of the war. And he crashes. And he's so close to death that when Joe Murray meets him at Valley Forge Military Hospital in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, and Joe had only 9 months of surgical training. Every medical student in America was drafted after the attack on Pearl Harbor. I think that is a chilling fact that everyone should know what it was like to live those days, which are very similar to the days that we're living with this pandemic. This is the generation that's living through this pandemic. This is their war, their chance to come forward and show their grit. And so basically, I was so touched by how hard these people worked, and the fact that out of this darkness of World War II, one of the first facts I learned that just riveted me in front of the computer was that all these people worked day and night to try to preserve life. When I learned the story of crush syndrome, that after the bombings in London, and they dug people out of the rubble, if they were still alive, they frequently had kidney failure, and they called it crush syndrome. If they could keep these people alive for 2 weeks or so, most often, their kidneys healed and spontaneously began working. So all the scientists around the world, despite the war, scientists work and they find out one way or the other, by hook or crook, what the others are doing, and they share their knowledge. And they were sharing knowledge about across borders of countries at war. And so they started looking for a bridge, some way to act as a kidney until these crush victims could regenerate the use of their kidneys. So in Nazi occupied Holland, there was a young physician who made a dialysis machine out of sausage casing and tomato cans, if you can believe that, and started saving lives. And he had blueprints. And in 1947, he dropped off those blueprints at the Peterbilt Brigham Hospital in Boston, which became their kidney, the best regional place for treating kidney disease in America, if not the world. So physicians started recommending that their patients go to be dialyzed at the Peterbilt Brigham Hospital in Boston. So basically that's how this story started. So you see that I had so many different parts, and to put them together, what I decided to do, I guess I may as well talk about the hardest problem I had, and that was the structure of the book, because each of these men wrote their own memoirs that were heavily medical and personal also, but being able to put them together. And that saved me, actually, because I had 4 or 5 books, and I would just put together those 4 or 5, as opposed to other historians which were going to do primary research in different libraries or whatnot. So I had 4 basic research materials, secondary and primary sources to draw from. So basically, I want everybody in the world to read this book, because when you find out how these men dedicated their lives day and night to saving lives, and their level of compassion, that just struck me as unforgettable. And their grit, they would never give up. And they lost so many people. And Joe was told when he was released from the military and he went to his residency in Boston, he said, don't get involved with the transplant idea. It's crazy. It will ruin your career. Well, thank goodness for these people who say, let me go ahead and ruin my career. I'm going to do what I think I need to do. And so it's basically a call to be the best you can be. And Franny Moore's secretary said that he always lived life on a different plane. He was dedicated to excellence for the sheer love of doing something at a very excellent level. He was wealthy. He grew up in a mansion on the river outside of Chicago. He did not need fame. He didn't need money. He merely loved doing something to the highest degree. So basically, I just can't say enough about, I want everyone to read this book, and also the immunology that's revealed of how the biology of the body works is very important in this age of COVID. And it's partly helps to understand how vaccines are made and how they're going to work. So it's general knowledge. And I just wanted to pass, as you know, Kevin, we had to cut out some stuff. As I like to go down side roads, I would get so excited about what I was teaching myself. And I did not have a science background. I can tell this funny little story. When the family said, okay, you can have a shot at this, and I've never written adult nonfiction before, so I kept telling myself, Shelley, if you mess up this story, there's going to be a reserved parking place in hell for you. So you better learn how to do it. So Yale has one of the most excellent programs for students to learn how to write creative nonfiction, which is very popular now. So I called that department and I said, I would like to come up there and take your course. Yeah. And I'm pretty old. I'm in my 70s. Would you allow me in? And the professor wrote me back and said, I'm afraid you would intimidate my students. So I was insulted. I thought he was talking about my age. And then he said, I think I've heard you on NPR. So then I was flattered. But anyway, I decided I had to teach myself. So I had several starts and stops, but when I fell back on my narrative skills of a novelist, that's when I gave myself permission. I said, Shelley, don't worry about being a kidney specialist. You need to show these people's character, their grit, their love for what they were doing, and their love for humanity. Oh my goodness, it's such an uplifting. I mean, we're telling the story of a man-made miracle, and it was just very valuable to have that kind of clay in my hands to mold.
And you know, that's very evident. Yeah, no, that's very evident in the book, Shelley, that, you know, you've got these 4 different men and their stories, and you expertly move from one to the other. And I think structurally, you tell the story by weaving in and out of the different perspectives of your main characters, but you always keep the focus on the characters, on these people as human beings, not just as scientists or as doctors, but as people that were doing something that they understood to be really important and valuable. Another thing that I think is very interesting is that, okay,
you help me keep that.
Well, thank you. But I think another interesting thing that I'd like to ask you about, Shelley, is that you were, as I said, these were, you know, this was a period when women did not have the opportunities that men had. So the main characters certainly are men, but the women are very important in this story as well. You know, the partners of these men and what they brought to the table, and you're really good at capturing their perspective and showing how important they were to the narrative. And maybe you talk a little bit about that piece of it.
Right. Well, that's probably my personal part, because I've been married to a pediatric neurosurgeon for 50 years. He's retired now, of course, but that going through that training, and when you marry someone that with those aspirations, you have to know up front that you are part of a team that is committed to a higher calling, something very valuable, saving lives. My husband 1 or 2 times started a surgery at 4 in the morning and went till the next night with different teams coming in to try to save a boy's life who was suffering from cancer. So you know that you're committed to that, and you have to be very independent. And I thought it would not be at all fair to these men or the story if they didn't have a full life. And the other thing I was so fascinated with was Dr. Moore has, in his memoir, and I included in my book, Lessons for a Long and Happy Marriage. And they were definitely a team. Of course, they married at a different time before the feminist movement, but all of their wives were accomplished and dedicated and very independent. And like, I think I've paged my husband 3 times in the 40 years that he was an active surgeon. One time, this is kind of a funny story, but I'll give you a view of what the partners go through. I crashed the car and it wouldn't move. And so I sat on that news all day long, and I said, well, I've got to call him about 5 o'clock. He had ridden his bike to work, so I knew he was going to come on the bicycle. Anyway, I paged him 1 of 3 times in my whole life that I paged him. And when he answered in the OR, I was hemming and hawing. I said, I have some bad news to tell you. And this, I don't want you to get mad and take a deep breath now or whatever. And he cut it and he said, hurry up and tell me what it is, because I've got my hands in somebody's brain. So I learned that that's the best time to tell him bad news. But also, I'd like to point out the fact that Joe Murray did this 5.5-hour first successful kidney transplant on December 23rd, 1954. 2 days later, on Christmas Day, Newton Wellesley Hospital called him and said, we have a kid in the ER who's busted her face on her new Christmas bicycle. Will you come and stitch her up? And he did. Yeah. So that's what I want my readers to know, is that it's wonderful to live a life with that kind of purpose. And I'm just, I want all, in fact, I've tried to, one of my dreams would be for this book to be required reading for college freshman entering, to understand not only the science that went into it, but the dedication of these men and women. And then Joe, one of the most wonderful things he said, he borrowed it from a theologian, but he said, work is a silent prayer. And that's a wonderful way to live your life. Dedicate yourself to a higher purpose, and all your problems and all those other things just kind of drain away.
Well, that's fascinating. Yeah, for sure, Shelley. I think in this current time when, there's so much in the news about vaccines and there's so much in the news about,
right.
I think people's suspicions of vaccines in some cases, and also the lack of respect sometimes that science is given. I think one of the great messages of your book is that science is not just crucial for us in how we live our lives and shape our culture, but also that science is a human thing, that it's got a human dimension, and you've got it's practiced by human beings who understand the purpose of science. It's not, it's not something removed from us. And I think your book, by bringing that science subject matter into the narrative lives of men and women, makes a profound contribution.
Right, and when I was coming upon that information, it hit me doubly, because we're living in a time now where science feels different and it's a dark time. And what occurred to me, that living through World War II, out of that came all this creative energy that led to the pioneers in transplantation, the pioneers in space exploration, from that dark time of World War II. And then, of course, the after time of the Cold War. And Peter Medawar, when he came to the United States for the very first time, it was at the beginning of the McCarthy era. And he was very aware of a chilling feel throughout the world, the scientific community. And after the war, I thought this was very interesting. American Foundation started funding British scientists, because everybody knew that this was a very fertile time in World War II for new treatments and new building, all sorts of creative energy would go into science and into all the fields, actually. So when he went back, he had a colleague, Milan Herrick, in Czechoslovakia, and according to scientific theory, they would repeat each other's studies, experiments, to duplicate them, to verify their theories. And they were wonderful colleagues. And Milan Herrick got caught in the Cold War shutdown in the belief of science, and his government began to change his results. And it was so hard for him, and to see what happened, he committed suicide. So I'll hit that hard, because I think we're on the edge of that in this country. And I'm very down about how uneducated the lay public is today. And I think that's why I just want everybody to read this book. It's so inspiring as well as educational.
No, of course. I think, great books educate, and like I said, great books educate and they entertain. Your book informs people. It tells us so much that's important, but it does it in a way that engages us and keeps us on the edge of our seats, keeps us reading. There's suspense there. There's not just the natural suspense of the story itself, which is interesting, but there's your momentum, the momentum that you create as a successful nonfiction writer and fiction writer, which carries us through and keeps us really engaged with the people in the story. This is a great American story, I would say. Shelley, is kind of one way I describe it.
Definitely.
Yeah, it's also a great New England story. One of the reasons we here in Boston loved taking this on is because Brigham and Women's Hospital is still a functioning hospital and still very much part of our medical landscape. And and of course Joe Murray and Franny Moore were both New Englanders. So, you know, there's a lot about the character of New England as well as the character of the United States. And it's really nice the way you gave us a sense of America at the time when these men were coming up and practicing what they did. And you know, there's a real feel for a real, I would say, a sense of place is how I put it, which is, I think, really marvelous in the book.
And yes, and I loved revisiting my memories, and also what I learned about, like Franny Moore, when he said he applied to Harvard Medical School, and it was during the Depression, and nobody could afford to go but him. He said, I can't even brag about getting into Harvard because, yeah, you know, the Depression affected everyone, and he was
Sure.
the only one of two who were married during medical school. And
Yeah.
and then the first woman to apply to medical school was admitted in 1945. And then I thought it was so refreshing and wonderful that on the front of his memoir is the cover is a photograph of him operating with a woman, female surgeon. And so it has that element to it. They were just amazing men. And when I met them when I was young, I didn't realize it. I didn't know Franny had been on the cover of Time magazine. I didn't know he had known John Kennedy. I didn't know that he had been referenced or used as an expert in all of the governmental programs that were coming about then. He had an afterlife after his being a surgeon and the chief of surgery at Harvard, as being a leader in the approach to healthcare. And of course, the story in the book that's just you can't ever forget is he admits his failures, and the little boy who died because they didn't have recovery rooms then. And a nurse picked him up from the surgical operating table, and he died on the way of her taking him back to his bed because she draped him over her shoulder lovingly. And Franny was the one who figured all of that out, the body's response to surgery. And he need recovery rooms. We need this, we need that. And so just the history of medicine alone and where it happened in Boston and the men who brought it about is just, to me, so inspiring. And of course, those were the days, my husband and I talk about this a lot. Medicine was an art, and it was practiced as an art and taught as an art. And it was not just chemistry and measurements and statistics. And of course, Joe and Franny practiced it that way. And then, of course, Peter and Medawar, oh my gosh, when I started researching him, I could not believe it. And I want everybody in America to know about him. He was British, and that's why we don't herald him like we do our other great heroes. But people that worked with him at Oxford compared him to Galileo. He was one of the most brilliant people who have ever lived. And what he discovered about the biology of the human body, they say, is equal to what Galileo did for the universe. And he was awarded the Nobel Prize when he was only 45. And then, of course, what happened in his life, I think the most serious discussion, Kevin, you and I had was about the epilogue. And that was my hardest decision, was the structure of the book. And because there's so much material and the science is so complex, I could have gone down 100 million different roads explaining this cell and that drug and this procedure and that. And I'm not a scientist, but I got lost a lot. And when I realized that I had to not be a kidney expert, but I needed to end the story after the first successful surgery, and then what happened in all those people's lives was the epilogue. And that's where I cut it. So I think you and I came up with believing and accepting the fact that I would have one of the longest epilogues in literary history. But what happened to Medawar, what happened to Joe afterward, and Charles Woods, the burned pilot who ran for governor and president, that I still have people that have bought the book and read it since it came out in April, who come to me and they said, we cannot believe the story of Charles Woods. We've looked him up on YouTube and watched him give his speeches during his presidential campaign. But after this man was horribly burned, over 70% of his body, and Joe built him back a face. And you can see pictures of him in the book and elsewhere. But his greatest nightmare was being the monster in children's nightmares when he walked out into the world looking the way that he did. And when he went home to Alabama, and I guess at that time he would be about 25, and his high school buddy said, well, you just need to collect your pension and grow turkeys and sit on the front porch and drink beer with us and listen to ball games. It was radio days. And he said, I didn't work this hard to stay alive, to raise turkeys or sit on the porch. He became a millionaire through construction. He bought TVs at the dawn of the television. He ran for governor against George Wallace. He ran for president and is buried in Arlington Cemetery. He lived into his 80s. But he alone is just a miraculous story.
And he's,
yeah, a lot of good parts to this, aren't there, Kevin? And I was just stunned once I started doing the research, because I thought, oh, this is going to be a dry book. How can I do this? And then when I realized it started with the skin grafts borrowed from a cadaver, a young man in the hospital happened to just fortuitously die that morning when Charles Woods arrived, and Charles Woods was only minutes from death from dehydration and infection. And Joe and his team of physicians decided, well, let's do a Hail Mary procedure. And they found this young man who just died, and they got in touch with his parents and said, can we harvest his skin? And they did. And when those skin grafts on Charles Woods lasted longer than 14 days, Joe Murray said, I have witnessed a scientific phenomenon. This can never be explained. And he asked the questions, why not borrow organs also to save a life? And that was the beginning, this creative thought of a young man who was so determined to end suffering and save lives. And Charles lived a long, useful life. And one of my greatest surprises and delights, I had looked for someone in Charles's family, like most people who came from World War II, they wanted a lot of children, big families, repopulate. He had 9 children. And so I started calling every city in America looking for Woods. And finally, I happened to think, well, if Charles bought a lot of TV stations, maybe one of those TV stations in Alabama is owned by one of his children. So I started calling around, and David Woods answered the phone. Wow. And when I saw his picture on the website, he looked just like Charles before his crash. And I've made such wonderful friends through the research. And I'll tell you another funny one. Joe Babb won't mind that I tell this. You know, Franny decided that they needed a painting in the Harvard Library of this amazing miracle surgery, successful kidney transplant, the first in the world. And it was a little bit of a race, and they wanted it to be an American hospital, American surgeons, to accomplish this. So he looked around for a painter, and he found Joel Babb. And you know, there's the most famous painting in the world in the Harvard Library, and that's the painting of the first surgery performed with ether. And every medical student knows of this painting because it's so important. So Franny decided we need the kidney transplant surgery hanging next to it, taking up a whole wall. So when I decided after we'd written the book, I need to find Joel Babb to see maybe if we could put it on the cover or whatever. So I called a gallery that was advertised for him. He answered the phone. I said, I thought you were dead. And he said, not yet, but almost. But anyway, he and I have become great friends. And he's so honored his painting now is on the cover. That was fun, wasn't it, Kevin?
Well, yeah, no, for sure. And it was
Joe.
wonderful to get that painting into the book, to you know, to get it onto the cover as well. And you know, I also I like to point out too to people that one of your appendices in the book is how to become a kidney donor. I think it's important for people to
Right.
realize that this is a story about Nobel laureates and about history, but it's about living history, because the fact that being a kidney donor is such an important part of, you know, our scientific and medical lives today, that it's all because of the work that these men did. And it just shows you that, you know, the past is always with us. And that's, I think, one of the great lessons of your book. But Shelley, I think Borrowing Life is a great story. I think it's a really compelling read. I think it's an important book, and I'm very pleased that you were able to join us today to be able to tell us a little bit about your experience of writing this book. And I want to thank you very much, and wish you the best of luck
Oh, it
with
was
this and with your future
my
projects.
pleasure.
Yes. Yeah.